Do you really have to record this? I know the FBI needs a record, but I'm just a substitute teacher. It's not my fault I'm a creature. Well, here's the story. If you must hear it, Mrs. Jenkins had a horrible class. Her students were driving her crazy. So one day, she called me and said she just needed a day off to rest her nerves. And would I come in and substitute? Because she had heard that I was really good with bad kids. I've been doing this for almost 50 years, so I told her sure. Well, the day of class, I show up, and sure enough, the kids are running wild. They're throwing things across the room. I see one little boy putting thumbtacks in every seat. It was one of the worst classes I've ever seen in my 49 years as a substitute. But what was I going to do? I had to teach these children something, so I decided to tell them some true stories. Mr. Creature's substitute teacher stories. So I told them about a boy who used to eat glue, but everywhere he went, everything started to stick to him because he ate so much glue. And pretty soon, nobody could see him anymore. He was just a walking ball of junk that had stuck to him, and nobody ever saw him again. Now that calmed the kids down a little bit, but not enough. So then I told them about the boy who daydreamed all the time. He never listened in class. He never did his work. And one day he dreamed of a giant dragon. And all of a sudden, coming up off the pages where he'd been doodling, a real dragon popped up and shot flames all around the room and chased all the children out of the building. Now that one got their attention. And I told them about a few other kids who had been really bad. But then, when they had finally settled down, I had all their attention and they were fairly quiet. I decided to tell them about Chris. You see, Chris was a boy their age who always liked to steal. Now, Chris really loved Halloween because he would dress up like a monster and run around in the neighborhood and scare all the kids. And when they dropped their candy, he would steal that candy and run away. But on his last Halloween, almost 50 years ago, Chris saw what he thought was a kid dressed up as a gnome. But this little gnome was a garden gnome. And he was magic. And when Chris scared him, instead of dropping candy and running, the garden gnome waved his hand and spouted a few words that Chris didn't understand. And all of a sudden, Chris's whole body started to shake and tingle. Tentacles shot out of his legs, and his head grew giant and hideous. And he turned into a ferocious, scary creature. And the gnome looked at him and said, "Until you learn your lesson, you will go through the world as a hideous monster that no one will love, and you will never see your family or friends again." Now, at this point, I had the kids' attention completely. Every one of them were listening well. And one little girl with tears in her eyes looked up at me and she said, "Chris never got to see his family again?" And I shook my head sadly and said, "No." And as I looked at all the kids at the end of the day, I gave them one last warning. And all of them said they would be good for Mrs. Jenkins. They would never get in trouble again. They would stop talking when they weren't supposed to. And they would listen. And they wouldn't daydream. And as I left the classroom, that's when your car came up behind me and put me in the back seat. And now, I'm having a hard time breathing. Now, I don't know what's happening. Now you see, halfway home, I started turning back into myself. But not the man that's 50 years old, that's been a monster, but the boy that I was the day I got caught by that gnome. And I'd learned my lesson. When I ran up to my house, it was still just like I left it. My bike was there, my dog was there. And when I ran to throw open the door, my mom and dad welcomed me like they'd just seen me that morning. But for me, it had been 50 years. You see, sometimes kids can be hard-headed, and it takes a while to learn the lesson. But take it from me, I'll never steal anything again. And I'll always remember the lessons I learned from Mr. Creature. So now, you can do whatever you want to with the FBI. Nobody's ever going to believe that I was actually a creature. Now you're going to look just as crazy as me.